Governor Rauner talks about cooperation in his State of the State address, but a Senate budget plan was delayed. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. It's been a busy week. Obviously, nationally, we have a new president, but locally, we have Governor Rauner, who gave a State of the State address. We will talk about some of those things. Hannah Meisel is back. She is Springfield reporter for Law 360. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
Hannah. And Patrick Yeagle, who is now associate editor of the Springfield Business Journal. Welcome back in your new life. Used to be with Illinois Times. Same ownership?
Yep.
Correct. Okay. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So Governor Rauner gave about a half hour, I guess a little less, of a State of the State address this week. He didn't propose, this wasn't his budget address, so he wasn't supposed to give all of the specifics of what he wants in a budget. What was interesting is Senate Democrats and Republicans have been working for a while trying on this giant compromise, which includes several facets, and the governor basically said, I'm going off script here for a minute. I just want you senators to know on both sides, I love what you're doing, keep it up. But we don't yet know if the governor will approve the final package, and there are certain groups aligned with him that are opposed to parts of it. So, Hannah, what did it look like from you? And obviously, some Democrats were saying they wanted to hear more from the Gov.
Yeah, the governor's tone of the speech was pretty markedly different. We're now like halfway through his first term in office. And if we remember 2 years ago, his first State of the State address, it was pretty, he pointed a lot of fingers at the, long-term problems we've had in Illinois. But this budget address on Wednesday was pretty conciliatory. Some might even say vanilla, which in some respects might be a good thing in negotiations going forward with Speaker Madigan. They've had, a very long-term fight behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, all over. So him being conciliatory and not pointing the fingers at him, it might be a good thing. But on the other hand, there were a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle, especially Democrats, but some rank and file Republicans who said, wait, it's, the governor's speech didn't make the situation in Illinois sound urgent. We are, now 2 years into a pretty historic budget impasse. I counted yesterday, it took 40 paragraphs in his speech for him to even mention the budget impasse.
Well, he was talking about accomplishments,
sure, right.
More computerization within state government,
right.
And use of less paper, which is the same kind of thing, and some criminal justice reform. So he was saying some of those things which people have agreed on, or he's doing administratively, but we still are actually operating without a budget at all, other than court orders, because January 1st started a new year when the stopgap budget, which funded the second half of last fiscal year, ended. So, Patrick, thoughts?
Well, his tone definitely was softer this time around, but if you, kind of read between the lines, he's really still saying essentially the same thing. We need a budget, but I also want you to adopt this package of reforms, that he calls the turnaround agenda. I think he might have kind of shied away.
Or bits and pieces of it.
Right. And so the issue with that, of course, is that Illinois has never tied adoption of, these reforms or whatever to the budget process, and that is really his only bargaining chip against, the Democratic legislature. And so, tying those things to the budget process has been problematic because a lot of those issues are ideological issues, and you're not going to get, the Democrats to just suddenly change their minds on all these ideological issues.
Yeah, well, and perhaps a couple of examples. You can call them ideological. They might have real results also.
Sure.
Term limits is something that the governor has pushed,
sure.
And you can say one of the things he wants is workers' compensation reform, which would clearly affect the business climate if it got done. And so you could see if companies come, that will affect the budget, as he says. And in the Senate plan, they're talking about that. But term limits would take effect way down the road, but they're popular. And redistricting reform may yield a better group of legislators eventually, according to many people who look at this. On the other hand, we're not going to redistrict Illinois until after the next census. So the election of 2022 is when you would see any results of this. And so there were some people like, for example, a Democrat that I spoke to, and one of the people who's among Democrats mentioned for governor, Kwame Raoul, he's a state senator from Chicago, who said he applauds the governor for having worked with Democrats on things like criminal justice reform, trying to lower prison sentences for certain things, drug offenses, that kind of stuff. On the other hand, he said that it's kind of, he was quite critical of the governor, including in what he wants right now, term limits and remap reform, when the state is operating without a budget, and there are social service agencies that have laid off people or closed, child care, that kind of thing, which can really help the struggling members of our society, and that haven't been helped by some of the funding that is able to go through court orders. So we'll see. I wanted to talk a little about, it's been called the grand bargain, but in recent weeks, President John Cullerton, Democrat from Chicago of the Senate, and Christine Radogno from Lamont in the suburbs of Chicago, she's the Republican leader, have really worked together to try to get a big agreement that could close the budget gap. Now, part of it would be $7 billion in borrowing to pay off some of the $11 billion in back bills. The tax increase would be, and they made a point of this, even Christine Radogno at the editorial board of the State Journal Register, they both came together at the beginning of last week to show a show of force, and they're talking about a tax level of the state income tax, which would go back from 3.75 now to, it was 4.95, and during the week it changed to 4.99. And I'm like, Republicans have been very critical of the 5%. When Mike Madigan even mentioned that it used to be 5% with the temporary tax that fell off at January 2015. And her response was, well, it's less than 5. And the thing is, that's one of the troublesome things that Republican members and Democratic members are going to have to vote for. My view is that Democrats aren't going to vote for this package, even in the Senate, unless they have some Republican votes. And they're going to have to be willing to go out on that limb, whereas the Democrats will have parts of that, like cutting into some benefit levels for workers' compensation, which labor folks don't want, trial lawyers don't like. So can we reach this kind of agreement at this time?
Well, I think we started seeing cracks on Tuesday when these things first started getting lots of discussion in committees, and those committees lasted a very long time, and then there was very long caucuses. And what we heard in the committees and outside after the caucuses is there's a lot to not like on both sides. Republicans don't think it accomplishes as much cutting as needs to happen. Democrats have a lot of lobbyists, especially from labor. You mentioned the minimum wage. It was only going to go up to, what was
$11?
But
yeah. And I think that's even out of the package now as we speak in the latest change, maybe because it's going up over a period of time, I think to 12 or 15 in Chicago. It's going higher in Chicago, but statewide, labor wants more and business wants not necessarily, the 11 that was in this
So this
package.
would have come, it would have contradicted other plans that have been in motion for a very long time. A big example of how state government works on the kind of nitty-gritty side is the proposed tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, soda. That is completely gone now because that group was able to hire a bunch of lobbyists. And it's
bought a few newspaper ads I saw opposing a tax on sugary drinks, and there's also been a recent tax like that imposed, I think, up in Chicago.
Right. That kind of thing.
It would add, more burden to the regular person, and they really understand that when you buy your 6-pack of Coca-Cola, you're going to pay more.
So that's an example of the longer something's out there, the more time the other side has to mobilize and get things thrown out, and so. You pick apart the plan, and then after the lobbyists have their say, what's left? It's a lot to.
Everybody has to be willing to.
It's a lot to contend with.
Well, and I mean, if you look at this, from the bird's eye view, they're trying to pack basically an entire session's worth of bills and issues, many of which have been tried before in previous sessions and failed.
Right.
They're trying to pack all these things into one package. I mean, any other year, any of those would be enough to keep them busy for the whole session, and trying to package them all together, I just don't see it happening without some serious compromises. And I don't think, they say, nobody's really happy, nobody's really satisfied at the end of a good negotiation, and that's good sometimes, but I don't think anybody's going to be even remotely satisfied with the outcome of this if they do pass it.
And just to bring out some more of what's being talked about, I mean, there's a big gambling thing. I mean, Illinois, I mean, I remember when we only had scratch-off tickets that, Governor Dan Walker first allowed.
Yeah.
But now we have, casino or video poker machines up and down various streets in and around Springfield and throughout the state. But this would have a big gambling component with a casino in Chicago, and I think 5 more casinos around the state. And to replace that sugary tax, they're talking about a sales tax on some services like dry cleaning that haven't been taxed before, and they're talking about an opportunity tax, they call it, for businesses to pay based on their level of how much salary they pay out in a year, what their payroll is. I think that the top one would be giant corporations only pay $15,000. And then on the other side, you've got, so that's what the Senate is talking about, and then the Democrats, Mike Madigan, Lou Lang is a top lieutenant of his Democrat from Skokie, who said after the governor's speech, we want things that Madigan talked about when he was sworn in as new speaker. A certain, lower the general tax rate, but make sure all businesses are paying, some more. They would like a tax on your income over $1 million, just on that incremental income eventually, but that would take a constitutional amendment. So we've got all these things in the mix, and usually in the old days when the sessions went till June 30th, it's now the end of May, sometimes there's a giant crush of stuff and then something emerges. And the problem is that they needed to emerge soon because the state is operating without a budget. So the Senate was hoping to vote this week. The leaders had said, the legislature's now off until the 7th of February, so they're taking a week off. When they come back, President Cullerton, I read, I wasn't there on that last morning, but said, be ready to vote. Let's hope we get this done. So do we have any predictions of if we can get something done?
Well, what Pat mentioned before about trying to squeeze an entire session's worth into, now 3 weeks worth of, it's a really good point. There's a lot to consider. And again, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know if
it's hard.
Legislators
will have to go against the grain and against a lot of their constituents in order to do this on all sides.
Like you said before, Democrats are not willing to. Democrats in the Senate are not willing to go forward on this without Republican votes.
Right. Yeah.
And then that's just the one chamber, and arguably that's the easier chamber because you got the House and. Oh boy.
Yeah, well, it is true. If we look at the 2-year span and that first speech Governor Rauner gave 2 years ago, his first State of the State, he accompanied it with a list of 44 demands for things. The Democrats ended up passing an incomplete budget, and the governor vetoed the whole thing except education, which kept schools open so that parents of school children across the state did not go crazy, but social service agencies and universities that weren't getting funding started to have their troubles. Moving on with problems with state government, we still have an unresolved contract with the largest state employees union, AFSCME. They have something like 38 to 40,000 state workers. Not all of them could strike because people in the prisons in certain public safety jobs would not be able to, but a strike authorization vote is coming by the end of the month or about that time. The governor's top lawyer, Dennis Marashko, as we tape this, it was just a report that he spoke to the editorial board of the Daily Herald up in the suburbs and mentioned that they're at least considering as an administration, if there is a strike, that the National Guard could be used to fill in some spots. And obviously AFSCME spokesperson has already said, well, that would be terrible. We have specialized jobs, we protect people, we take care of kids, and to just even talk about this is terrible. So I just bring that up to say we don't really have a solid, we've been, I think, more than a year without an AFSCME contract, and they're just operating on the old contract. So where does this go?
I mean, a couple things here. First of all, I think that if AFSCME does strike, it plays into the governor's hand. I mean, I think they've been trying not to strike, and they're basically reaching their breaking point. From a public, relations perspective, the optics of AFSCME striking is probably going to look good for the governor and bad for the unions, because it looks like, oh, those darn unions are shutting down the state government. And but if the governor were to bring in, National Guard, granted they're probably not going to be carrying their rifles or anything, that probably would kind of shift that PR back toward the unions, I think, especially because, I'm sure that the National Guard folks are very capable, but they're not trained to, administer databases and, take care of kids who have, disabilities and stuff like that.
And certainly there's a lot of positions within the state government where you need specific training
Absolutely,
that you couldn't just
absolutely.
call somebody off the street and say, do this, even though you're a fine person.
Right,
you're
and
in the
so,
Guard.
you can say, yeah, maybe we could have them fill in for maybe the police, but I don't really see that going anywhere.
Well, we'll see where it goes, as you say, and we bring up the National Guard, and that brings up something that, I mentioned at the beginning of the show. We have a new president, President Donald Trump. He talked during his campaign more than once about the violence in Chicago, and clearly violence in Chicago has been a horrible thing with more than 700 people shot to death in the city last year. Of course, it's a city of 3 million people, but that's a lot, and that's more than they've had in a long time. And so President Trump, who I understand he tweeted that Chicago better fix this mess they're in. It was the same word he used in
carnage.
The carnage, or we'll send in the feds. Now, people don't exactly know what that means, and we don't know if it means National Guard, but I did see a report that Governor Rauner already said he's not planning on using National Guard in that way. And then there's also an executive order signed by President Trump saying that they don't want certain grants to go anymore to sanctuary cities, which is where local governments have decided we're not going to help round up or identify illegal people who, undocumented foreigners who live in our confines. And there are various cities in the state that have that, including Chicago and Evanston. And the mayor of Chicago and Daniel Biss, a state senator from Evanston, another guy who's thinking of running for governor or being thought of in that way, have both said, we're going to resist what Donald Trump says. But that could mean that cities like that may lose out on certain grants. So we're coming into some conflict between the feds and the state here.
Oh, yeah. And I don't see, first what you mentioned, if Chicago does get cut off from federal money, Chicago is already in pretty dire fiscal shape as it is. That would be not good. However, I don't see Rahm Emanuel, losing that money and then partnering up and, becoming buddies with Donald Trump. Rahm Emanuel, one, has a very strong personality. That's just not in his personality. And two, Rahm Emanuel was on President Obama's staff. He's not going to just bend to the will of Donald Trump, once President Trump threatens money. Now, I see a lot of conflict in the next 4 years, especially if President Trump continues harping on Chicago's violence, which, yes, has to be fixed.
And of course, President Trump said during the campaign at one point in an interview, well, I talked to some police official in Chicago and we could fix it in a week if we just handle it right. We have yet to see that. We know that there are indications the president sometimes speaks boldly.
Right. I also want to mention Governor Rauner on Wednesday also did mention violence in Chicago. He called it intolerable. And but he put forth economic development.
Like we need jobs.
Right, and I don't know if that's going to be fast enough for President Trump. Those kinds of things take, months, years.
Yeah. And I will say that, one of the reactions to the speech was the Black Caucus of the legislature had a press conference afterwards, and I think there was a lot of criticism of the governor for talking about the need for economic development when many of the programs, the social service programs, the after-school programs, and the summer jobs programs that have been hurt by the budget impasse would help keep kids off the street and doing positive things and possibly not end up in violent situations. And so they're blaming Governor Rauner for, not reaching a budget compromise, even though he wants all these other things, because he has been, not wanting to approve more revenue unless some of his turnaround agenda gets done.
And I think it's worth pointing out that the president's executive order has limits because there's a Supreme Court decision that says the federal government cannot force states to adopt policies they don't like by threatening unrelated funds. So, say I want to threaten you with your Fund A, because I want you to adopt some policy related to Fund B, I can't withhold Fund A to get you to adopt that.
That all
Fund B.
sounds very neat, although I think with the new federal administration, we might see some testing of what,
Yes,
what has been normal processes
Yes,
in
that's
the past.
probably
So,
a good prediction.
So we'll see where that goes. I note what's interesting and kind of a backdrop to the governor's speech this week is his relationship with Rahm Emanuel. They used to be friends. They worked in business somewhat together in the past, but there was a bit of a war of words where Mayor Emanuel of Chicago called Governor gridlock and said there was a rudderless state under his direction for 2 years, and this was like a day or two before the speech. And then the Rauner team's response was called the mayor of Chicago Madigan's mayor, and that he should get under control his own murder capital, city. So I'm not sure that all of that is working to the greatest. Other federal programs that, that's just showing that people are not necessarily getting along, and you can give a nice speech, but people are still arguing.
Yeah.
Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, is something that clearly one of the first acts of President Trump was to sign an executive order that says that his agencies don't have to, or can basically not enforce regulations they don't have to right away, and it's the beginning of dismantling of Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act, which has, I don't know if it's something close to 1 million people in Illinois got insurance through that program. People are worried where it goes. Senator Dick Durbin, who lives in Springfield, had a meeting with hospital officials in Springfield last week where it was clear that those people in the healthcare field say, well, many people are now insured, and we also are worried about not only a change in that program without a known replacement, but also talk of some in the new administration of block granting Medicaid instead of keeping it under a particular federal system might hurt a lot of people who are getting the care and administering the care. So I just think we're going to see a lot of discussion about this, and the federal government may have more impact on kind of day-to-day operations in a lot of things in Illinois than we've been noticing lately because there's so much change afoot.
Right.
Yeah.
Governor Rauner did write a letter to President Trump. I don't know where those letters go, but
yeah, well, somebody up there. Well, there's fewer people from. When you send a letter to the Obama administration, you could probably call somebody from Illinois because Obama was from Illinois,
Sure.
and people in our government knew people in their government. I'm not
Right.
sure how close. Our Governor Rauner doesn't yet mention Donald Trump's name
Right.
on a regular basis, if at all, but says he has friends in the administration, and we know that he likes Mike Pence.
Right.
So.
Well, he wrote this letter to basically just ask President Trump's administration to hold off on the dismantling. States have to figure out what they're going to do. Illinois is one of the states who expanded Medicaid and expanded it pretty aggressively. And I believe half the ACA beneficiaries are in the category of the expanded Medicaid.
Okay.
And so he didn't mention that in his speech yesterday at all, but it's going to be pretty messy.
Right.
When, if there is a day that suddenly patients no longer have coverage, and what is the state going to do?
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out that this whole law was put into place because of kind of the complicated situation surrounding people who don't have insurance, and it's an expensive situation for not only the hospitals but for taxpayers and people who pay insurance premiums, because it basically jacks the rates up on everyone who does have insurance. And so the whole law was meant to take care of that situation. It's not a perfect law, but I don't really see any reason we have to repeal the law in order to change it.
Well, you obviously didn't just run for office as a Republican member of Congress,
Right, certainly.
Most of whom think differently. But
Certainly.
It's interesting. One person who did is Darren LaHood, who represents the 18th Congressional District. He lives in Peoria. His district comes over into Springfield. I was able to speak to him like the afternoon after the inauguration of President Trump, and he talked about, he was looking forward to various things happening, infrastructure, et cetera. And he said, a lot of changes will come quickly, but he did mention that on Obamacare, maybe a little slower, because I think there is a realization that without a replacement right away, which the president actually tweeted during this process, needs to be like maybe the same day. He wants it done quickly. But as the Democrats will say, the Republicans have been trying to repeal this for, pretty much the whole time it's there. And while there are certain parameters of a replacement on, I think it's better.gop, Rodney Davis, the other congressman representing Springfield, will be very happy that I mentioned those coordinates, better.gop. That's where the Republican plan is. But when I asked him a specific thing about that plan at our editorial board, and one part of that is that there would be grants to people to pay for their insurance. I said, where would those grants come from, and where would that money be generated, and how much would it come from? And he said, Bernie, you're not going to catch me on a specific like that because we know what that's about, which means that they don't have specifics yet.
Well, certainly, and that sounds a lot like the Obamacare tax subsidies for purchasing insurance.
Well, we'll see what goes on. There was one, I guess it's positive unless you have to implement it, and it might be tough, but we should give credit is due. Chicago Tribune did a pretty good series. In fact, Ray Long, who used to work in Springfield, was part of the team. I think he was a key reporter on this series. Going to a lot of drugstores across the state and finding out that drugstores, pharmacists were providing like 2 prescriptions that, if they mix, could hurt or kill you. And they found out that the safeguards don't seem to be in place in a lot of stores to make sure that you're not mixing drugs that have bad interactions. So the governor, in responding, got a good headline in the Tribune this week, in responding to this, said he's going to impose all kinds of new rules so that they will have to do more checking and more talking to the people coming to the stores. On the other hand, if you've been to some drugstores to pick up drugs, there can be lines, it can be long, and this will probably increase costs, so we'll see where that goes. But it sounds like at least something good is happening out of a journalistic story. So,
Go Tribune, that's great.
We'll
Go
see
journalism.
Yes, well, we miss Ray Long in Springfield, but we like the reporters that remain covering the beat around here. That about brings us to the end of today's discussion. We are hoping that everything gets better in the entire world. But we'll see how that goes. Hannah Meisel, thanks for being here. Patrick Yeagle, thanks to you. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.